Washington just erupted with not one but two absolute bombshells that have the White House in full crisis mode. The Senate delivered a devastating bipartisan rejection of an attempt to federalize the Kennedy Center, and within hours, a federal judge slammed the Trump Organization with a crushing $75 million fine for systematic fraud. We're talking about a coordinated collapse on two fronts that has political and legal implications unlike anything we've seen in modern history. Hit that subscribe button on Capitol Breakdown right now because this story is developing fast and you need to stay ahead of it. Let's start with the Kennedy Center situation because what just happened in the Senate is absolutely unprecedented. For those who don't know, the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts has been an independent cultural institution in Washington since 1971. It's governed by a board of trustees, operates with a mix of federal funding and private donations, and has maintained its independence from direct political control for over 5 decades. That independence just became a major battleground. According to multiple congressional sources, the White House quietly drafted an executive order 3 weeks ago that would have effectively placed the Kennedy Center under direct federal control. The justification was supposedly about ensuring accountability for taxpayer dollars and protecting American cultural values. But lawmakers from both parties who reviewed the draft order immediately recognized it for what it really was: an unprecedented power grab targeting one of America's most prestigious cultural institutions. Smash that like button if you're already seeing where this is going. Here's what the executive order would have actually done. It would have dissolved the current board of trustees and replaced them with presidential appointees. It would have given the White House final approval over programming decisions, including which performances, exhibitions, and artists could appear at the center. And it would have created a new oversight commission with the authority to review all funding decisions, effectively giving political appointees veto power over the institution's operations. When news of this draft order leaked to Capitol Hill, the reaction was immediate and fierce. Senators from both parties recognized this as a direct assault on artistic freedom and institutional independence. Within 48 hours, a bipartisan coalition had formed to block the order before it could even be officially issued. The Senate vote that just took place wasn't on the executive order itself. It was on emergency legislation that would permanently protect the Kennedy Center's independent governance structure and explicitly prohibit executive branch interference in its operations. And here's the stunning part. The legislation passed 68 to 32. That means 18 Republican senators broke ranks to join all 50 Democrats in blocking this White House power play. Let that sink in for a moment. 18 Republicans just voted against their own party's president to protect an independent cultural institution from executive overreach. When you see that level of bipartisan opposition, you know the administration crossed a line that even loyal allies couldn't defend. Drop a comment right now with your thoughts. I read every single one. According to senators who spoke on the record after the vote, the decision to block the takeover wasn't particularly difficult. A Republican senator from a swing state told reporters that the executive order represented exactly the kind of government overreach his constituents sent him to Washington to prevent. He emphasized that conservative principles include limiting executive power, not expanding it to control cultural institutions. A Democratic senator who sits on the Appropriations Committee was even more blunt. She called the attempted takeover authoritarian behavior disguised as accountability, and warned that if the Kennedy Center could be federalized by executive order, every independent institution in America would be vulnerable to political control. But here's what makes this particularly significant. The Kennedy Center isn't just any cultural institution. It's a living memorial to President John F. Kennedy. It hosts performances attended by foreign dignitaries, Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, and presidents from both parties. Its programming includes everything from opera and ballet to contemporary music and experimental theater. It represents American cultural achievement and artistic freedom on a global stage. The idea that any president could seize control of such an institution and dictate what art Americans are allowed to see there sent shockwaves through both political parties. Even senators who typically support expansive executive authority couldn't stomach the precedent this would set. Don't go anywhere. The court ruling that just dropped is even more devastating. Constitutional law scholars are calling the Senate's action a critical reassertion of legislative authority. A professor from Yale Law School who specializes in separation of powers told cable news that this vote represents Congress drawing a clear line against executive overreach. She explained that while presidents have broad authority in many areas, attempting to seize control of independent cultural institutions crosses into territory that threatens fundamental freedoms. A former federal judge added that the executive order, if it had been issued, would have faced immediate legal challenges on First Amendment grounds. Government control over artistic programming and cultural expression raises obvious constitutional concerns about censorship and political interference with free speech. Now let's talk about the second bombshell that dropped. While the Senate was voting to block the Kennedy Center takeover, a federal judge in the Southern District of New York was issuing a ruling in an ongoing fraud case against the Trump Organization. And the decision was absolutely brutal. This case stems from allegations that the Trump Organization systematically defrauded lenders and insurers through a scheme involving Trump-branded properties licensed to third-party developers. The scheme allegedly worked like this. The Trump Organization would license the Trump name to real estate projects, then provide inflated valuations and false occupancy data to help developers secure financing. In exchange, the organization received licensing fees and profit-sharing arrangements that were directly tied to how much funding the developers could obtain. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that the Trump Organization knowingly provided false information to banks reviewing loan applications for at least 7 different projects across 4 states. The false information allegedly included fabricated presale numbers, inflated appraisals, and misleading financial projections. When lenders relied on this fraudulent data to approve hundreds of millions in financing, the Trump Organization collected millions in fees and revenue sharing. Hit that like button because this gets even more damning. The case went to trial over several weeks, with prosecutors presenting a mountain of evidence. Internal emails showed Trump Organization executives discussing how to inflate property values to maximize developer financing. Text messages revealed coordination with appraisers to generate valuations that had no basis in market reality. And testimony from former employees described a systematic pattern of providing false information to lenders with the explicit goal of increasing licensing revenue. The Trump Organization's defense was that they were merely providing marketing support to developers, and that any false information came from the developers themselves, not from Trump Organization executives. But prosecutors demolished that argument by presenting evidence showing Trump Organization employees directly creating and submitting the fraudulent documents to lenders. In her ruling issued this morning, the judge found the Trump Organization liable on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and making false statements to financial institutions. But it was the penalty that sent shock waves through the legal and business communities. The judge imposed a $75 million fine. That's not a damages award that might be reduced on appeal. That's a civil penalty specifically designed to punish the fraudulent conduct and deter similar behavior in the future. And the judge made clear in her written opinion that the size of the penalty was necessary given the scale and duration of the fraud. According to legal analysts who reviewed the full opinion, the judge's language was remarkably harsh. She described the Trump Organization's conduct as systematic deception carried out over many years with the sole purpose of maximizing profit through fraudulent means. She noted that the organization showed no remorse, offered no restitution to victims, and continued to deny wrongdoing, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Stay with me because the implications of this ruling are enormous. The judge went further, stating that this wasn't a case of minor accounting errors or good faith disputes over valuations. This was deliberate fraud designed to manipulate the financial system for personal enrichment. She emphasized that the Trump Organization had exploited the trust that lenders place in financial documents, undermining the integrity of the entire lending process. Legal experts are noting that this $75 million penalty is among the largest civil fraud fines ever imposed on a real estate organization. A former federal prosecutor told reporters that the size of the fine reflects the judge's conclusion that the Trump Organization's conduct was not only illegal, but also deeply damaging to the financial system's integrity. A white-collar crime specialist added that the penalty sends a clear message to other businesses that might consider similar schemes. If you systematically defraud lenders to boost your profits, you'll face crushing financial consequences that make the fraud unprofitable. Now here's where these two stories intersect in a fascinating way. On the same day, the Trump administration suffers a humiliating defeat in the Senate over executive overreach, and the Trump Organization gets hammered with a massive fraud penalty in federal court. The timing couldn't be more symbolic. Both situations reveal the same pattern: an attempt to bend rules, norms, and institutions to serve personal or political interests, followed by a decisive institutional response that says no, there are limits and you've crossed them. The Senate vote blocking the Kennedy Center takeover demonstrates that Congress still has the will to check executive power when it goes too far. 18 Republican senators essentially told their own party's president that seizing control of independent cultural institutions isn't acceptable, regardless of political loyalty. The court ruling hammering the Trump Organization with a $75 million fine demonstrates that the legal system still holds powerful organizations accountable for systematic fraud, regardless of political connections or public profile. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know your perspective. Let's examine the political fallout from the Kennedy Center vote. Those 18 Republican senators who broke ranks are now facing intense pressure from different directions. Trump loyalists are absolutely furious, flooding social media with demands to primary every senator who voted for the bill. They're framing this as betrayal and evidence that even Republicans can't be trusted to support their own president. But political analysts note that these senators made a calculated decision. They represent states where voters care deeply about limited government and institutional independence. Voting to block an unprecedented executive power grab actually aligns with the conservative principles their constituents claim to value. They're betting that voters will ultimately respect defending those principles over blind party loyalty. Meanwhile, the vote has energized Democrats and given them a powerful talking point. They're highlighting that even Republican senators recognize this attempt to control the Kennedy Center as authoritarian overreach. Campaign ads are already being produced featuring the bipartisan vote as evidence that the administration has gone too far. The failed takeover also creates a broader precedent that will constrain future executive actions. If a president can't federalize an institution like the Kennedy Center, even with expansive claims about accountability and taxpayer oversight, it signals that other independent institutions have protection from similar attempts. Now let's look at the legal implications of the $75 million fraud penalty. This ruling creates serious problems for the Trump Organization beyond just the immediate financial hit. The court's findings of systematic fraud will follow the organization into every future business dealing. Financial institutions reviewing loan applications will see that a federal judge concluded the organization engaged in persistent deception of lenders. Insurance companies will factor in the court's determination that the organization made false statements to obtain favorable terms. Business partners will consider whether they want to associate with an entity that a court found liable for conspiracy to commit fraud. The reputational damage may ultimately cost far more than the $75 million fine. And that appears to be exactly what the judge intended. By issuing such a substantial penalty and using such harsh language in the written opinion, she's ensuring that the consequences extend far beyond a one-time payment. Subscribe to Capital Breakdown right now so you never miss critical updates like this. Legal experts also note that this ruling could open the door for additional lawsuits. Lenders who weren't part of this case, but who also received false information from the Trump Organization, may now file their own claims for damages. The judge's findings essentially serve as a roadmap for future plaintiffs, establishing that the fraudulent conduct occurred, and that it was systematic rather than isolated. There's also the question of criminal exposure. While this was a civil case resulting in a fine rather than criminal charges, the evidence presented could potentially support criminal fraud charges. Prosecutors at both federal and state levels may review the case record to determine whether criminal prosecution is warranted. Here's what makes both of these stories particularly significant. They represent institutional pushback against different forms of overreach. The Senate blocking the Kennedy Center takeover is the legislative branch checking executive power. The court imposing a massive fraud penalty is the judicial branch holding a powerful organization accountable. These institutions, Congress and the federal courts, are demonstrating that they still function as checks on power despite intense political pressure and partisan polarization. That's a critical signal in an era when many worry that institutional guardrails are failing. But let's be honest about the challenges ahead. The Senate vote, while significant, doesn't resolve the underlying tension over executive authority. The White House could attempt to achieve similar goals through different means, perhaps by threatening to cut federal funding to the Kennedy Center, or by using regulatory pressure to influence programming decisions. And the $75 million fine, while substantial, may not be enough to fundamentally change the Trump Organization's behavior if the leadership continues to believe that the benefits of fraudulent practices outweigh the risks of getting caught. If this analysis is valuable to you, hit that like button right now. The Kennedy Center situation also raises broader questions about the vulnerability of independent institutions. If an executive order attempting to federalize a prominent cultural institution can get far enough to require Senate intervention, what other institutions might be targeted? Museums, universities, foundations, and other organizations that receive some federal funding could all theoretically face similar attempts at political control. Legal scholars who study authoritarianism note that one common pattern in democratic backsliding is the gradual erosion of independent institutions. Cultural organizations, universities, and media outlets are often early targets because they shape public discourse and can serve as platforms for dissent. The attempt to seize control of the Kennedy Center, even though it failed, fits that concerning pattern. Similarly, the fraud case against the Trump Organization highlights ongoing concerns about accountability for powerful business entities. If an organization can engage in systematic fraud over many years before facing serious consequences, it suggests that enforcement mechanisms may not be robust enough to deter such conduct in the first place. Congressional oversight committees are reportedly planning hearings to examine both situations. The Kennedy Center vote will likely prompt examination of what other executive orders might be in development that could threaten independent institutions. And the fraud ruling may trigger congressional inquiry into whether existing laws adequately address the kind of lending fraud the court found in this case. Leave a comment below. I'm reading all of them. For the White House, these twin blows create a narrative problem that's difficult to spin. Losing a Senate vote with 18 Republicans defecting undermines any claim of unified party support. And having a federal judge impose a $75 million fraud fine on the family business while describing the conduct as systematic deception creates a credibility problem that extends beyond legal matters. Political strategists note that these kinds of institutional rebukes from Congress and the courts can erode public confidence, even among supporters who might dismiss partisan criticism. When your own party's senators vote against you and when federal judges issue harsh rulings backed by extensive evidence, it becomes harder to maintain that everything is a witch hunt or political persecution. The Trump Organization has already announced plans to appeal the fraud ruling, claiming the judge was biased and the penalty was excessive. Legal experts expect the appeal to focus on challenging the size of the fine and arguing that the court applied an incorrect legal standard in determining liability. However, appellate courts typically give substantial deference to trial judges' findings of fact and penalty assessments, especially when the record contains extensive evidence. Unless the Trump Organization can demonstrate clear legal error, the fine is likely to be upheld or at most reduced somewhat, while the core liability findings remain intact. Regarding the Kennedy Center, the White House has issued a statement claiming the Senate vote was based on misinformation about the proposed executive order, and that the goal was always just basic accountability, not political control. But that spin is undermined by the bipartisan nature of the vote. When 18 senators from your own party reject your position, claims of misinformation ring hollow. Before we wrap up, make sure you're subscribed to Capitol Breakdown for ongoing coverage of both stories. Here's the bottom line. The Senate just delivered a stunning bipartisan rejection of an attempt to federalize the Kennedy Center, with 18 Republicans breaking ranks to protect institutional independence. Simultaneously, a federal judge hammered the Trump Organization with a $75 million fraud penalty after finding systematic deception of lenders over many years. These aren't isolated incidents. They're examples of institutions, Congress, and the courts pushing back against overreach and holding powerful actors accountable. The Senate vote demonstrates that legislative checks on executive power can still function when enough members put principles above party loyalty. The court ruling demonstrates that judicial accountability for fraud remains viable, even against politically connected organizations. The political implications are significant. Republican senators who voted to block the Kennedy Center takeover are facing backlash, but betting that their constituents ultimately support defending institutional independence. The fraud penalty creates lasting reputational and financial damage for the Trump Organization that extends far beyond the immediate $75 million fine. Watch both of these stories closely. The Kennedy Center legislation now heads to the House, where it's expected to pass with similar bipartisan support. The Trump Organization's appeal of the fraud ruling will unfold over coming months, with potential implications for additional lawsuits and possible criminal charges. This is accountability in action. This is how institutions are supposed to respond when lines are crossed. The stakes remain high, the battles continue, and Capitol Breakdown will be here covering every development. Hit that like button one final time if you found this breakdown valuable.